Thank you so much. I'm Marianne Williamson. You probably know that. I'm running for the Democratic nomination for the candidacy for President of the United States. You probably already know that. I'm saying some things that are a little bit differently. You probably know all that as well. Although in other ways, I'm saying things that other Democratic candidates are saying. There are ways in which there are unified chorus of certain messaging, which is extremely important because we all know what the bottom line is. We must defeat Donald Trump at the polls in 2020. I have strong ideas, however, about number one, what I don't think will defeat him. And number two, about a larger mission that we have. Because if all we do is defeat him, but don't really put forth a transformational vision, which accomplishes a kind of transformation, then the same forces that he represents will be back in 22 and back in 24. We need to do more than just not fall over the cliff here. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff entirely. And we have been too close to the vicinity of the cliff for a very long time now. A lot of these problems, Donald Trump did not create them so much as the problems created Donald Trump. And in that sense, I'm not just prosecuting a case against Donald Trump. I'm prosecuting a case against the system that produced him. A same old, even a better version of same old system that produced him, number one, will not defeat him, I don't believe. But even like I said, if it defeats him, it will not cast those forces from our midst. And that is a deeper job that we have on our hands. And that is why I am articulating a conversation that I believe and that we all can recognize goes deeper than the conversation that is promulgated by the conventional political establishment. The conventional political establishment in this country is too narrow a container for the energies which must emerge at this time. These energies are not just American. They represent a global impulse towards an evolutionary alternative to the direction that the human race is taking at this time. Now, some people say that the problem with me is that I'm naive, you see. The idea that I believe love rather than market forces disconnected from all moral and ethical considerations should actually be the operating principle for human civilization. Some would say I'm naive to say that. Let me tell you what I say. They're naive to think we will survive on this planet for another 100 years if we do not make that change. And it is time for those of us who believe that to say so unabashedly, without apology, without embarrassment, and within the political sphere. Because it's very convenient to stand on the sidelines. It's very convenient, particularly in a city like this, where we know we're just going to get applause for saying it. But I have long felt that those of us who feel strongly about higher consciousness and evolutionary potential in the human race are the last people who should be standing on the sidelines when it comes to weighing in on the economic and social and political issues of our day. We should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. Because if you have a clue as to what changes one life, you're the one who has a clue what will change this world. Because change does not happen just because you make some incremental changes. The idea you're going to tweak a policy here, you're going to tweak a policy there, you're going to make this policy change, this incremental change. That's like saying you're only going to treat the symptoms, but you're never going to treat the cause of a disease. And if all you do is treat the symptoms, then the symptoms will simply morph into another symptom. Or in political terms, the next president will come and repeal everything that you just did, or the next legislature will come and repeal everything that you just did. The problems are deeper. And the solutions must be made deeper as well. We have on our hands now, not just one policy that's nutty or another policy that's nutty. We have a bigger problem on our hands than that. We have the fact that a sociopathic economic system has corrupted the United States government, has hijacked America's value system, and what lies in front of us are two choices, enlightenment or fascism. You look down the road, it's going to get either really light or really dark, and we better start articulating something really light even within politics. This president will not be beaten with a purely political argument. I don't think he'll be beaten with a purely economic argument. And unfortunately, he will not be beaten even by just a purely rational argument. I've been saying to Democratic politicians for years, you guys don't seem to understand. The part of the human brain that rationally analyzes an issue is not always the same part of the brain that decides who to vote for. I'll tell you how the president will be defeated. He will be defeated on the basis of a moral argument. And right now, the only argument being waged against him on the level of morality is almost high school. What you're doing is really immoral. That's where we're coming. What the president is doing is really immoral. It's got to be bigger than that. We have to present a moral alternative. We have to present a moral politics. And even though too many of the Republican politics are immoral, too many Democratic politics are amoral. We need more than amoral. We need a moral politics. To me, there are 4 pillars to a moral politics. I hope you'll hear me. I hope you'll reflect on them. I hope you'll think about them deeply. And if you feel that they are the correct path for America, I hope you'll help me win the presidency. Number 1, we need a moral economics. This craziness has been going on for 40 years. 40 years. Ever since trickle-down economics was presented to us as the economic guidance system that was going to lift all boats. When I was growing up, the American corporation was expected to care. Imagine. It was expected to care. If somebody had worked for you for decades, you were expected to care whether or not that person had a dignified retirement. But starting in the 1980s, it came out of a Chicago school. It was called the Chicago School, University of Chicago School of Economics. Milton Friedman was the main articulator, but I mentioned his name because I want to tell you in a couple minutes what he actually said, which is very, very pivotal. Their idea was that if all the corporation owed was fiduciary responsibility to the stockholders. Now think about this really deeply. The idea was all the corporation should have to do was to take care of the financial rewards for the stockholders. Government should get out of the way with all those pesky regulations like health regulations, safety regulations. They termed that job-killing regulations, right? So they said if government will just get out of the way and all that a corporation has to do is serve the bottom line of its stockholders. So the story went, this was going to be great, see, because all this money would get made by this stockholder class and all the money would trickle down. All the money would trickle down and it would lift all boats. Well, after 40 years, I think it's safe to say the jury is in. It not only has not lifted all boats, it has left millions and millions of people without even a life vest. It has created the largest income inequality since 1929. It has decimated America's middle class and has left us in a situation where 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Now, I mentioned Milton Friedman before. I want to tell you a tidbit which is extremely interesting. Milton Friedman himself said, but of course, for all of this to work out, there must be a universal basic income. So the people who submitted that and profited and spent billions of dollars putting it forth, they themselves left out what was an extremely important safety valve that Milton Friedman himself articulated. Be that as it may, it did what it did. It got hold of the U.S. Political system in a very, very nefarious way, because later on in the 80s, the 90s, and onward, the unbelievable explosion of the undue influence of money on our political system that then climaxed with the Citizens United. So you've got the Citizens United decision allowing unlimited corporate power and influence financially on the American political system. This has left us with a system here, and you and I are the adults. You and I are the generation that must deal with this. Our political system has become little more than a system of legalized bribery. And what they do is they do more in terms of public policy, and this is not only domestically but also internationally, I'm afraid. More of our policy is driven by advocacy for short-term profits for huge multinational corporate entities than it is driven by advocacy for the health and well-being of the American people, the people of the world, and the planet on which we live. If you think this political system is going to interrupt that or fix that, I suggest that you think a little more deeply. The conventional political establishment is not the fix to all this, ladies and gentlemen. The conventional political establishment is the problem. It is time for the people to step in now. And if you look, I think this is a very, very good time to read up on American history. Go to say, if you don't remember what you learned in the 7th grade, or you didn't really learn it because you were thinking about something else, this is a good time to go buy one of those like American History for Dummy books or something like that. Because it's really a fascinating story and it's an important story. And when it comes to the history of the United States, just like with the history of your family when you go to therapy, or the history of your tribe or your ethnic group, you're empowered by an understanding of your history. And we're empowered by an understanding of American history as well. So let's be very, very clear. In 1776, the most enlightened principles that were ever coded into the foundation of a country were coded into our Declaration of Independence. The gnarly part is that the men who risked their lives to establish those principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, the equality of all people. Governments are instituted to secure those rights, and it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish that government if it's not doing its job. Those principles were laid down by men, 41 of 50 some odd of whom were themselves slave owners. So this dichotomy has been with us from the very beginning. We have been throughout our history not only a nation built on the most aspirational and enlightened principles ever coded into the founding of a country, but we have also been throughout our history. Throughout our history, we have at times represented the most violent transgression against those principles. All I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the first time. We are not the first generation to have to push back against forces that are essentially undemocratic. They did it before. Slavery was responded to by abolitionists, and the suppression of women has been responded to by 2 major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement. Institutionalized white supremacy and segregation was responded to by the civil rights movement. We are not the first time to have to deal with this. Let's just not be the first generation of Americans to wimp out on doing what it takes to push this. When you write a book, it's very interesting. But also, let's be very clear. Abolition did not happen because the conventional status quo of their time politically rose up and went, let us end slavery. That's not what happened. The abolitionist movement arose from the early evangelicals and the Quakers. In other words, the people stepped in. That's what caused the political change to begin. Same with the suppression of women and the women not having the right to vote. The American government didn't wake up one day and say, let us give women the right to vote. With the women's suffragette movement, the people stepped in. And same with segregation. The American government didn't wake up one day and say, let's end segregation. With Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, the people stepped in. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, if you think the traditional political establishment with the billions and billions of dollars invested in a donor class that keeps the situation basically as it is, if you think they're going to rise up and they're going to change this, like I said, not going to happen. It is time in American history, once again, as it has been before, for the people to step in. And of course, they call that a long shot. They want that thought lodged in your brain. Of course. And I certainly challenge the idea that only somebody whose career has been entrenched for decades in the system that drove us into this ditch is the only person we should consider qualified to lead us out of this ditch. We have been trained, see. We have trained to expect too little. We've been trained to question too little. We've been trained to complain too little. And that will be the death of America. No. We were born of a rambunctious spirit. That is the characterological DNA of this country. Our country was founded out of a rebellious and rambunctious message given to the aristocratic systems that had dominated Europe for centuries. A system in which a very few people were deemed entitled. A king and the king or queen's few rich friends remind you of something. And that system was the idea that a few people were entitled to land, a few people were entitled to education, a few people were entitled to the opportunities for wealth creation. and nobody else was. We repudiated that nonsense in 1776, and it is time to repudiate it again. All that has happened here is that our country has regressed. That's all that's happened. That's why Franklin Roosevelt talked about how the forces he was fighting were economic royalists. It's just an aristocratic paradigm. You can talk about it in terms of oligarchy, corporatocracy, but it's all the same paradigmatic issue. It's an archetype of a few people have the power or the power belongs to the people. It's one or the other. And that's why Louis Brandeis, the late Supreme Court Justice, said you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. So let me tell you what we need to do as I see it. We need a moral politics. The House of Moral Politics has 4 pillars. Number 1, a moral economics. And in that, my economic ideas are very similar to the Bernie Sanders, the Elizabeth Warrens of the world. We need to repeal the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut. We need to put back in the middle class tax cut. We need to stop these ridiculous subsidies. We pay $26 billion in subsidies to the oil and gas industry. We pay 10 times more to that than we pay to education. Martin Luther King used to say if they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. Right? We need to stop this ridiculous way that our own lawmakers have negotiated against us in making themselves unable to negotiate for lower drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies, the chokehold of big pharma, the chokehold of health insurance companies, the chokehold of the gun manufacturers, the chokehold of oil and gas, the chokehold of agribusiness, the chokehold of food companies, the chokehold of chemical companies, the chokehold of defense contractors and the nuclear industry. This will not stop until we say enough is enough. Right? And that is by sending not only a president to Congress who's never taken money from these people, ladies and gentlemen, who's never taken the money, who isn't part of that, has not tied into that, is not tied into it. And also, of course, you need a House and a Senate goes along. But, you know, whoever the next president is, the Democrat, please, dear God, let it be a Democrat, whoever it is going to have to deal with Mitch McConnell, if Mitch McConnell is still there. But the way I see it is if we have enough of a consciousness shift in this country to elect me, we probably have enough consciousness shift to get rid of him. But even though economics is extremely important, even though the undue influence of money on our political system is the cancer underlying all the other cancers, I want to mention to you 3 other issues which make up the pillars of a moral politics. The first one has to do with America's children. And I want you to really hear this in your heart. We have what I'm proposing to you, we need an integrative politics. The politics we have now, the conventional political conversation is stuck somewhere back in the 20th century. It's kind of like old allopathic medicine, where you didn't take care of your body, you didn't cultivate your health. But then if you got sick, you tried to get external remedies to suppress or to eradicate the symptoms. We need an integrative approach, dealing with causal issues and also dealing with all the psychological and emotional and other human issues besides just externalities. So hear me, please, not just with your mind, but with your heart. Millions of American children live with chronic trauma. In the richest country in the world, we have 13 million hungry children. We have millions of American children who go to school every day asking their teacher if maybe the teacher has something for them to eat. We have millions of American children who go to school every single day in classrooms that do not have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. If a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased. And the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Millions of American children live with such chronic trauma for it to be defined as PTSD, and a form of PTSD that psychologists say is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. Have you heard any politicians talking about this recently? No, because all that the conventional political establishment has done with the despair of these children is to normalize it. And we have this huge sea of unnecessary human suffering. And these children are citizens of the United States, by the way, but they're not old enough to vote. So they're not a constituency. They're not old enough to work. So they don't have any financial leverage. How can they possibly compete with the clout of all the corporate money that floods Washington? You see, we have a political system that treats voters like we're poker chips. And too many of us in too many ways have conspired with this. We've allowed ourselves to be treated like observers. We've allowed ourselves in many ways to be treated like spectators. You're like a poker chip. How many do you have? How many do you have? And if you're a child, you don't vote anyway. So your poker chip doesn't matter. We need a massive realignment. If you elect me president, I want a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children, particularly 10 years old and younger. If you want to see, you know, I used to ask myself, I remember asking myself, because when I was a child, politicians used to always use the phrase peace and prosperity. And so I remember asking myself, I wonder why they don't say that anymore. You don't hear politicians going on and on about peace and prosperity. And I remember how my mind went, because my mind first went to, oh, I guess they don't say that anymore because it's kind of a cliche. And then I thought to myself, that's not why they don't say it. They don't say it because that's not the goal anymore. You want a goal of prosperity and abundance and economic abundance for all 10 years from now? I'll tell you what you do. You take better care of your 10-year-olds today. You want to see the genius, if you want to see the power that will fuel the most amazing explosion of economic prosperity in this country over the next few decades, I'll tell you where it is. It's not in the ground. It's not power in the ground like oil. It's not in the sun either. And it's not in the wind either. It's in the brain of every child. If you go to the kindergarten in any neighborhood, in any place in the United States, that's where your potential entrepreneurial spirit is. And I'll tell you something else. In a country as rich as ours, to withhold education from a child simply because we base our educational funding on property taxes, how immoral is that? And it leads us to withhold education from children for no other reason than that they come from less advantaged neighborhoods. That is a passive form of oppression. And that's why, thank you. That is why I want a U.S. Department of Children and Youth. It's not enough. You hear a lot of politicians talk about how we need more money for education, which we certainly do. We need more money for teachers. We need to get rid of these standardized high-stakes testing, all of that. But it's more than that. It's more than when they say we need universal preschool. Ladies and gentlemen, millions of American children are traumatized before they even get to preschool. We have a relatively high rate of maternal health, maternal mortality. We have a relatively high rate of infant mortality. So I want a whole holistic coordination, not only having to do with education, also having to do with early childhood understanding of the brain, of psychology, and so forth. And if you elect me president, there's going to be a big change there. We're going to set this country up to win by taking care of the people who will be adults 10 years, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. Second place where we need to get real and we need to get deep and we need to get transformative and we need to do some radical truth telling, just like with children, just like with everything else I'm talking about, is on the issue of race. I do not believe the average American is a racist. That's not my belief and it's not my experience. But I do believe that the average American is vastly undereducated about the history of race. And it is my experience in some of the whitest states in this country that when you just kind of lay it out for people, we're a good people, we're a decent people. I'm not saying Americans are better than anyone else, because we're not, but we are as good and as decent. The problem is not that the American people are not the problem. The American political system is the problem in that it is not aligned with the consciousness of the American people. In issue after issue after issue, if you look at the polls, where the American people stand is okay. It's the fact that our government has been hijacked by other forces. And because of that, we are not politically taking on some of the issues that matter the most because they don't fit into the conventional political formulation of what power is about in America. In 1619, the first enslaved people were brought to this country. The slavery was not abolished for 249 years. Almost 250 years of slavery in this country, at the end of which there were between 4 and 5 million enslaved persons. Those people were promised by Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, 40 acres and a mule. Now, I know we've all heard that, but I'd like you to join with me once again. Integrative, expand it, listen with your heart. Think about what this means. You were a slave. Now you're not a slave. What are you supposed to do? Where are you supposed to go? How are you going to feed yourself? How are you going to feed your family? I mean, it's nice that you're not a slave anymore, but what are you? And as Martin Luther King would say 100 years later, they were freed. But what were they freed to? So the 40 acres and a mule was promised. It was then taken away. In most cases, it wasn't ever given. In the case where it was given, most of the time it was taken back. And as soon as the federal troops left in 1877, the Southern legislatures passed what were called Black Code laws. And Black Code laws were to guarantee subpar economic and social and political opportunities for Black people. Thus ensued 100 years of domestic terrorism against Black people in the American South. What do you call lynchings if not domestic terror? What do you call the Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terrorism? What do you call segregation if not domestic terror? So we're talking about 250 years of slavery, followed by another 100 years of institutionalized violence against Black people. That's 350 years. Ladies and gentlemen, that's longer than this country has been in existence. 100 years after the end of the Civil War, finally, the United States passed the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation. Then it passed the next year, the Voting Rights Act, which ensured that Black people would have equal access to voting. However, even that, since 2013, has been chipped away at by the U.S. Supreme Court, which is why we have this spate of voter suppression efforts all over the country. So the issue of economic restitution to address the economic gap that began at the end of the Civil War and has never been really abated on the kind of fundamental level that would mean true justice. We simply haven't gotten to it yet. As your president, I want to end one chapter of torture in this country and begin a new one. Let's do this. The German people... Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. It doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, and that has to do with stuff right around here, where we gave to every surviving prisoner of the Japanese internment camps between $20,000 and $22,000. So by the middle of the 20th century, the idea of economic restitution in the form of reparations from one people to another that they had wronged was not considered fringe. It should not be considered fringe. And that is why I have submitted a proposal for reparations for slavery. Very quickly, I'd like to say why it is a reparations plan as opposed to just race-based policies. Because most of the candidates are saying, oh yeah, we have to have a commission and we have to understand, we have to more evidence, and then we're going to come up with race-based policies. Let me tell you why I disagree with that approach. First of all, we have plenty of evidence. Secondly, race-based policies alone leave open the question, whose fault this is. Whereas reparations, inherently, there is a mea culpa. There is an inherent declaration and admission of a wrong that has been done, the recognition of that wrong by a people, the recognition of a debt that is now owed, and a willingness on the part of those people to pay that debt. Therefore, reparations has moral force that simply race-based policies do not carry, because race-based policies are part of the old paradigm. Just try to fix something on the outside. Whereas reparations actually carries moral force so that there's a psychological and an emotional healing that can happen. It won't fix anything, but it will go a long way. We have been carrying since 1865 this burden of karmic toxicity, one generation to another. It is time. The Americans are not tired because we're doing too much. We are tired because we are not doing enough great things. We we also need to do it. It's simply a transformational principle. You can't have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up the past. That's why we have to deal with this in terms of race. We also need to deal with it in terms of Native American justice. With Native Americans, it's not quite as simple as an economic gap that can simply be handled. Not that it is simply handled, but it's a slightly different, more complicated issue. With Native Americans, it has to do with very unfairly negotiated treaties. It has to do with treaties that were negotiated and then broken. It has to do with not only, as we know, not only physical, culture, but also cultural annihilation and genocide, moving people from one area to another where there was no opportunity for them to make a living. We need to give back the Black Hills of South Dakota, the vast majority of that, which were promised in 1863. So with Native American justice as well as with blacks, let's take some reparative measures. Let's do something big, do something fundamental so that this country can move on to a new And in a way, I have saved the worst news of all for last. I hate to tell you. That has to do with national security. And if you should be appalled by anything, you should be appalled by the fact that of all the people running for the Democratic nomination, only 2 of us even touch it. And that should tell you everything you need to know. Okay? So our national security agenda, just like so much of our public policy, is driven more by short-term profits for huge multinational corporate entities than it is driven by advocacy for people and planet. So what I have great respect for the military. My father fought in World War II. I don't think any of us don't think we need to have a strong military. Our military, though, should be like a surgeon. If you have to have surgery, you need to have the best. But you avoid surgery if at all possible. Now, for those of you too young to remember, let me give you just a little bit of an American history here. There was a man named Dwight Eisenhower. He was the supreme Allied commander in World War II. He certainly understood the military and what its needs are. He then came back to the United States and served as a Republican president from 1952 to 1960. When he gave his farewell address, it was he who coined the phrase military-industrial complex. Because before World War II, the United States didn't have a standing army. I don't think any of us fail to recognize we need a standing army. But Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex because once that started to happen, there was a lot of money to be made. I want the U.S. military to have every cent that it needs in order to address our legitimate security concerns. The issue is not about military policy. The issue is about political policy by which short-term profits for defense contractors are served that have absolutely very little to do with our national security. Given that with national security, just like with health of the body, you can't just take medicine. You have to cultivate your health. And with war and peace, the same is true. Sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And war is the absence of peace. Peace isn't the absence of war. We can't just spend all of our resources on endlessly preparing for war. Even Donald Rumsfeld said, we must wage peace. But if we wage peace, let's talk about the real facts of the matter here. Our military budget is $750 billion a year. Our State Department budget is $40 billion. State Department is mediation, diplomacy, and development. Within the State Department, there are 2 main peace-building factors. One, the USAID, which is humanitarian aid, $17 billion. And peace-building agencies. The peace-building agencies get, in total, less than $1 billion. Peace-building efforts, peace-building activities take just as much sophistication as do military activities. And let me tell you the 4 factors, none of these will surprise anyone, which statistically mean, when present, there will be greater incidence of peace and a diminished incidence of violence. Number 1. Greater economic opportunities for women. Number 2, reduced violence against women. Number 3, expanded educational opportunities for children. And number 4, amelioration of unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. That is why, for me, if you make me president, all domestic and international policy will be built around the core that in order for us to have peace and prosperity in this country, on this planet, we will pass policies which have as their bottom line the tendency to help people thrive. Right? in terms of international policy, large groups of desperate people should be seen as a national security risk. Desperate people do more desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. And that is why when I'm president, if you make me president, and you do have the power to make me president, if you make me president, we will have a United States Department of Peace, because our national security agenda should be a robust partnership, a far more robust partnership between our defense departments and our peace builders. The head of the USAID should him or herself be have a seat at the table of power, should be a cabinet level position. The people who are actually the peace builders will not be treated like just a little something on the periphery, like we do now, less than $1 billion compared to $750 billion for defense, and compared to something like, listen, I love this one, the International U.S. Institute of Peace gets $1.6 million. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is just one more area where it's not going to be changed unless it's challenged. And it's not going to be challenged from within a system that makes so much money off this. I'll just leave you with one example, and then we'll just close it up with a larger philosophical context. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raiders each cost $550 million. And the interesting thing about the B-21 Raider is that it is built to drop not only conventional bombs, but also nuclear bombs. So I just would like every person in this room to just take a moment, because maybe you can tell me something I don't understand. Why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs? Because you drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. And let's be very clear. Every nuclear bomb that exists on the planet today makes Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like pinpricks. You drop 10 of those, it's over for the human race on this planet for probably, they say, 200,000 to 300,000 years. So do you think that we have 100 B-21 Raiders at $550 million each only for national security purposes? Are we stupid? Because we're acting it. And leadership, you see, leadership, political leadership, should not just be deciding what we're going to talk about. They tell you what the issues are. Not only that, but political leadership should not just be talking to you about how this or that might please you. This or that might get your vote. Political leadership should be about saying the things that need to be said. Political leadership should be about saying the things that matter. And Martin Luther King said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. Now, darkness isn't a thing. It's the absence of a thing. It's the absence of light. You can't hit darkness with a baseball bat and hope to get rid of the darkness. You have to turn on the light. So much of the collectivized hatred, racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia that's now formed this field of collectivized hatred in this country, which has been given a megaphone in a way that it had not been by social media, and that it now is being stoked by no less powerful a person than the President of the United States, cannot be defeated directly. You cannot defeat dog whistles. You have to override them. You have to drown them out with a more beautiful song. That more beautiful song, the President is not a politician, ladies and gentlemen. He's more than that. He's a phenomenon. And the only way we will defeat him, even at the polls in 2020, is by creating among ourselves a phenomenon of equal power. And that phenomenon is not just a bunch of wonky talk. You know, it's not just a matter of we will do this with this policy or that with that policy, as important as those issues are. We need to create a phenomenon, a political phenomenon that emerges from people waking up, emerges from people who really get at the deepest level, what the hell is going on here? What the hell is going on here? And in some cases, taking responsibility for what we know in our own hearts with our own acquiescence, our own chronic political disengagement. We all have something to look at here. But the point is, it's the 11th hour now. It is not midnight. Far more people in America love than hate. There's no question about that in this country and in this world. But those who hate in this country and in this world have become very political, very strategized, and they hate with conviction. And conviction is a force multiplier. And so we have to love with conviction now. We have to stand on what we believe with as much conviction. We have to stand with conviction for the fact that we will not allow a virulent form of capitalism. Now, I don't believe there's a real conversation. I saw a socialist t-shirt or something. There's a lot of conversation about whether or not capitalism can have a conscience. I believe it can. I believe that this is about the consciousness of people. So I don't believe that this is necessarily means we can't have capitalism. I don't. I believe capitalism can have a conscience. But capitalism better quickly reclaim its conscience, or I'll tell you something, not going to be me that's going to storm the Bastille, but that Bastille will be stormed by an entire generation of Americans. The good news is how many very powerful capitalist leaders in America today do know that. Jeremy Grantham, Ray Dalio, and others. But the point is, we need to stand very clear that what is happening now, a basically sociopathic form of capitalism, a sociopathic economic system, which displays no conscience, no morality, no ethics, no concern for who gets sick if this happens or even who dies, that stops now. That stops now. But we also have to have equal conviction around traumatized children. We have to have equal conviction around issues of race. We have to have equal conviction about issues of the environment. We have to recognize the destruction of our environment as an ongoing process, as the greatest moral challenge of our generation, to not just stop it, but to actually reverse climate change, to actually create what you think that just because a Democrat wins, that the fossil fuel company is going to go, oh, okay. It's not going to be enough to have a Democratic president. We need more than that. We need to be awake, because that president, whoever is going to take that same stuff and those same obstructions, it's got to be all of us who are so awake. And not only do you have to wake up in order to elect a Democrat, not only do you have to really wake up to elect me, you have to wake up and stay awake, or we will just fight this stuff. We have to be awake and just as convicted around national security and around what is happening in this world. That for the sake of $350 billion in arms sale to Saudi Arabia, we are giving aerial support to a genocidal war in Yemen, where tens of thousands of people have starved, including children. What are we doing? Our grandparents would be rolling over in their graves. It was I will say, a bipartisan effort that was led in many ways by Bernie Sanders. Tried to stop this. The president overrode it. We have just sacrificed all moral authority when it comes to our leadership in the world. The Dalai Lama said to me, the people of the world no longer look at America as a champion of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm old enough to tell you, it's not like we ever got it completely right. We know that. But there was a time where you could see that we were trying. There was a time where at least there was a consensus that we were supposed to. That is what has happened in America today. It's like when we put any kind of a complaint up at the most horrific immoral behavior, we now have forces in this country in power to say, yeah, what of it? And we don't have quite enough people to say, I'll tell you what of it. And it can't be just singular issues. It can't just be that we show up about a Muslim ban. It can't be just that we show up about children at the border. It can't be just that we show up about this or just that we show up about that. We have to show up, period. We have to be a generation. We have to be a generation of Americans now that expects a whole lot more. And we have to expect a lot more from progressive political forces, just as we have to expect a whole lot more from everybody else, because it is we who need to remember now that we have the power. And those of us who have children know what happens, usually somewhere between 14 and 16, usually has to do with some of those sex, drugs, and rock and roll and alcohol, whatever. And you find yourself saying something that you never thought you'd say, but you heard your parents say it. And that's when you say something like, young lady or young man, that will not be happening in this house. Do you understand? And you're kind of laughing inside because you actually don't know what you would do if they challenge you at this point. But there's a look that's so fierce on your face, they're not going to. You're just clear. That's dangerous. That's not going to happen in this house. Do you understand? And if they then challenge you, you find yourself saying something you never thought you'd say. And that are these words, because I said so. That's what we need to become as citizens. Certain things Slavery will simply stop happening in America. Why? Because we said so. Thank you very, very much.